What does our reaction to another person's pain mean about us as humans? Why, when someone experiences something heightened, heavy, painful, or extraordinary, can we feel it in ourselves, in our bodies, and in our hearts? Responding to a poem called A Retreat to the National Forest, Ostensibly to Pray, we reflect on all the ways we belong with each other as human beings. Today on Don't Hold Me to This. The poem is pretty straightforward. It's a poem literally about being in the mountains and cutting the ends of my fingers almost off. The poem is not quite
I
finished
read
yet.
it, Jeremy. I read it kind of like this. I was
Yeah,
just,
yeah. Like that horror movie where one of the protagonists is walking up the stairs to the door that you know spells their fate, and you're like, "Don't! I know you're gonna do it, but don't do it. Like I know what's coming." But when you told me that, you texted me that it made you feel fidgety, and I put that in the email that went out to Substack. It made me kind of go off in a slightly different direction. So there's a couple of things that come to mind as I think about what that poem does to us. One is like to take it kind of purely as an allegory, like how we create the tools of our own disappointment. We create the tools of our own wounding, and that's not to blame the victim. It is you and I have both experienced real wounding at the hands of other people, and I don't blame either one of us for that. But there are, I think, ways in which we really do sharpen the blades, which end up cutting our fingers off. Right, and that's one way to go. Maybe an uninteresting way to go. But when you sent me a text about feeling really fidgety as you read the piece and wanting to be able to look at it with only one eye instead of both, it made me wonder about this embedded sense of our ability as humans to share experiences which we didn't actually share, to feel something that someone else has felt, not because we were there to feel it with them, but because part of what makes us human is this inbuilt bias toward empathy. And it made me think, against maybe all of my simplistic Calvinism, like, we're, as human beings, we're really good. We're really good. We're also really bad. But like, to have this ability to feel something, viscerally feel something that we've not experienced, but someone else has, as they communicate it to us, we feel it. That suggests this deep connectedness that I think in many ways is part of what it means to be human, and in many ways unavoidable. Like, if somebody can avoid it, we consider that a pathology. Right.
yeah, yeah. It's interesting. Yeah, because it's visceral. To read it is for me is to respond. My response is a visceral response. It's not, yeah, it's not calculated. And then I think, so then I think, to just to add on to that, we're able to empathize and sort of feel along with somebody in their humanity in those moments. And then we have this real ability to in a moment, if I'd have been with you in that moment, I would have been able to set that visceral response aside to also enter in to help you
Mm,
tend to something that affects me viscerally, and
mm-hmm,
I repulse from it.
mm-hmm.
Um, but also we have this real great ability to enter into the those really difficult places and care for one another. Kind of over against that response, that gut level
Mm-hmm.
response. I think both of those things speak to something good
Mm-hmm.
about our humanity and our ability to empathize and care for one another.
Mm-hmm. Those two things together, the ability to feel with someone enough to recoil when we simply read about their misfortune, and the ability to feel with someone enough to move past that recoil if we're present and able to offer aid, suggests a larger, like, overarching circle that I, at the risk of repeating a theme that comes up, I think, in our conversations quite a bit, I think that overarching circle is a sense that we belong with each other. We
Mhm.
belong to each other, we belong for each other, and we belong with each other as human beings. And I think those three things are distinct, although there's a ton of overlap. To belong with each other, I think, is that sense of the ability to feel what someone else is feeling, even if we've not experienced it personally, because we are with each other. We are in this together. We have enough in common as fellow humans to know that when a knot from the string tied to the pommel of a knife is caught underneath a knee, the next thing that happens is bad, right? We just know it. As the knife starts sliding out, and I didn't notice it, we all know this is whatever's coming next is going to be painful. Um, to describe the sliced fingers as fish gills breathing is just totally accurate and utterly disgusting. We know it. And that's what it means to be with each other. And I think that pushing through that recoil to offer aid, if in fact we're present when somebody's hurt, is that, like, I belong for you. Like, there's a
Mhm.
sense, because we're the same, I'm responsible to some degree for your well-being. And it'd be interesting to see the sort of the ripples of that stretch beyond a an immediate physical need in the instance of a physical wound, out to, like, our social responsibilities to our neighbors. I think those things are all existing on this on a spectrum, like ripples coming out from tossing a pebble in a pond. And then that belonging to each other. I remember Nicholas Walterstorff in his book. Full disclosure, I didn't read the book. I just listened to Walterstorff talk about it. Justice, rights, and wrongs. He's talking about, we generally think about rights within a Western context, of what all of you owe to me. There's a centripetal movement in our grammar of rights. What This is what all of you owe to me. And I don't think that's wrong. And I don't think that Walterstorff was arguing that it was wrong. But what he wanted to introduce into the conversation was a centrifugal sense where my grammar, when it comes to rights language, shifts to what is it that I owe to you when I come into your presence, when I can reasonably have a set of duties toward you. What is it that I owe as our proximities meet? And maybe that's what it means to belong to. Although that's the one that makes me the most uncomfortable, because that's maybe the one I ha- have imagined with the least depth.
I think what you're describing has been in the social imaginary in the past. And the reason I think, or one of the things that comes to mind is I think about what you're saying is I think about the the nights following the accident,
Mm-hmm.
listening to Pump Line, which is the Anglicans prayer before bed.
Mm-hmm.
And part of that prayer that just always just it was soothing to my soul, is this part that says, "Keep watch, dear Lord, with those who work or watch or weep this night,
Mm.
and give your angels charge over those who sleep. Tend to the sick, Lord Christ. Give rest to the weary. Bless the dying. Soothe the suffering. Pity the afflicted. Shield the joyous, and all for your love's sake."
Mm.
Because one of the things that I walked away from the scene of the accident acutely aware of, among the things that I walked away acutely aware of, was the men and women who work that stretch of highway, as first responders. And that prayer led me to pray for them every night, that the way that trauma affected them, and those griefs and that horror affects them, that they see over and over again in different ways and different stories and different senses of loss and brokenness, that I understood that they were standing a post for our community. And they're the people who keep watch, right? They're the ones who have taken on that role. And they do so for the sake of the community. And so I think that, at least in the Book of Common Prayer, there's an accounting for that belonging with and to each other,
Mm-hmm.
that sense of connectedness. And then one of the things that's come up to me as I've been driving DoorDash is just this job that I don't want, right? It's not the job I want. And I think about then in my mind is raced kind of around the idea of these jobs that exist that people do. And for some reason, I never really watched it. I'd seen bits of it, but I think about dirty jobs,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
right? And part of that was kind of an it was an invitation to go into those places where people are caring for the community. They're doing a job, and in some ways, I think they enjoy their job because they understand that I'm doing this for us. This isn't simply about a paycheck. This is about how our community we have to have this for our community to function in as a healthy a way as possible. So I think belonging, the idea of belonging with and to. And what was the other one? Did you say four?
Mm-hmm.
What was the third one?
Yeah, belonging for.
I feel like all of those have been again a part of the social imaginary, even if in a very corrupt way. Like I think the whole caste system, the British royal system, had that notion of, part of the understanding of your station was an understanding of, we are in this together, and and we exist for one another. Again, I don't think that's not an endorsement of the caste system.
Don't hold me to this. Don't hold me to this.
Or the way Charles Taylor describes the priestly role, and the role of Carnival was part of why the part of the what the priest system was intended to do was to sort of represent the ideal among the community, but with an acknowledgement that very few people can even approach the ideal. And so we're going to hold it out, and we're going to put it in a special garb and special office to help us hold the ideal within this communal space, recognizing that we can't live out this ideal. And so we have these special people who sort of live the quote unquote holy lives for us and with us, and hold it forth as in a priestly way, right? That's there wasn't an expectation that everybody was to live like the priest.
It makes me think of the requirements for a king when Israel was moving toward the land flowing with milk and honey, and Deuteronomy 16 anticipates that they're going to ask for a king. And the rules that God sets out for them is one, it must be one from among your own brothers. It must be somebody who is one of you. And I think if we can go back to the caste system, one of the problems is that sacrifice in that system only flowed upward, right?
Right.
So that there was a belonging to without a belonging with. That's what it lacked. There was not a withness in those castes. There was a responsibility that flowed upward, but nothing that would suggest that those people were in anything together. And what the requirements for a king in Deuteronomy 16 do is it takes that tiered system and just flattens it right out. He you can install a king, but he must be like you, from among you. He must have been with you. He can't take your sons off to war. He can't amass for himself many horses, gold or silver. He can't gather all that to himself. He not only must be from you, he must go on being one of you. Now, none of the kings did that with anything nearing perfection, or even with any kind of facility, but the rules, I think, suggest the belongingness, the withness, and the forness, and the two-ness. Those things all have to go together and stay together, or you inevitably get this corrupting influence of power, this distancing that a kind of wealth disparity creates between people on top and people on the bottom, where the people on top continually want the sacrifice only to flow upward.
Yeah, and I think if that's, I think that's a great point. And if we want to then flip to Jesus, in his kingship, he does actually flatten it, right? He talks about the whole story. He's from Nazareth and of Galilee, and he's born in a lowly estate, and he has the genetic ancestral pedigree, and won't stand on it. He continues to constantly invert attempts at making the sacrifices flow upward, and he won't abide it.
Hey friends, it's Jeremy. Thank you genuinely for listening to this episode of Don't Hold Me to This. We are honored that you listen, honored that you read our writings over on Substack, and just honored that you'd be a part of this podcast with us. We'd really appreciate your help in growing this effort. You can do that by sharing with your friends our episodes on YouTube or Spotify, and by clicking the like button, subscribing, following, and leaving a comment, even just to say Susan was here. It'll all really help us out. Also, sign up for our written pieces at don'tholdmetothis.substack.com. Okay, thanks a ton, and back to the conversation.
That makes me wonder from the other side of the equation, if we have this hardwired, which we do, need for connection, right? This is, oh, that's what Brene Brown says it that way. We're all hardwired for connection. I think it's Kurt Thompson who says we all come into the world looking for someone looking for us.
Mm.
Um, and so if that's our our deepest, truest hardwiring, uh, where do you where do you think where do you think we lose
Mm.
empathy and compassion and the impulse to be for, with, and to each other?
Mm. In my new job, I share an office with another manager. My official title is project manager, and there's another manager he's in charge of the department that does installation of a lot of the things that we build. It's like a innovation manufacturing company is where I'm project managing, and we share an office just because it was convenient and there was an extra desk in there and another chair, and it's not a very like corporate structure. We're in an old warehouse, and it's a really wonderful environment, very flat organizational structure, and so we just sort of do what works. um, and one of the owners of the company will be retiring in June, and he has an office, his own office, sort of deeper into the warehouse, away from the sales room, away from the reception where customers and clients will come in, away from the shop floor where there's huge flatbed printers and CNC machines and welding and construction and vehicles inside there, because he's the CFO, so he does a lot of the financial stuff and needs that like focused time to be able to do that. And he told me that when he leaves, I'm welcome to take over his office. And that is super attractive. I'm a off the charts extrovert. I love being around people. The people that I work with are really wonderful. They are incredibly creative and hardworking, and they all love what they do, and they clearly all love each other. And we have a really collaborative environment, so I really love it. And there's something that's gravitational about the possibility, the invitation to have this other place. And I can justify it with regard to the need to have some private meetings, some time to think strategically about our systems and how to make them work more efficiently and more transparently. There's a lot of there's a lot of collaborative interruptions taking place right now throughout the course of my day. And if I were back in that other office, there wouldn't be. So I could justify it with all of that. And there's something about the status of having an office deeper into the warehouse or higher up in the skyscraper
The C-suite, the C-suite
exactly.
office.
And what's funny is that this office, you would, if you were to walk into this warehouse and see this room, you wouldn't identify it as a C-suite office. There's no window. There's no corner window.
Not a corner.
There's not a corner. There's it doesn't have its own restroom attached. There's no mini bar, you know. It's really like relative to the sizes of the other offices is it's more of a closet than an office. But something about maybe just the fact that the CFO and the owner, one of the owners, used that as his own office, sort of now stamped it with this level of status that it wouldn't have had otherwise. And it's a very hard friction that I am now fighting, because I want to work along with and beside the rest of the team. Some which are doing more like what we call white collar work, and some doing which we think of more as blue collar work, but all of us are working on it together, and I want to be a part of the team, and there's still that pull, and I don't know that I can name it adequately to achieve some higher apparent status by taking this other office. And I don't know if that explains all of the situations in which people lose their empathy and generate a system in which sacrifice starts flowing the wrong direction, upward instead of downward. But it seems that the gravity of that offer um, has a lot of explanatory force for the reasons why we as humans abandon our witness to achieve some other end for ourselves.
Yeah, I think that's helpful. I don't know that I didn't have a particular answer in mind. It just it 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 comes to mind as I think about it. And so then another question comes up for me, and we've talked about this some. You and I've talked about this kind of thing. What do you think it takes, would take, might take to have the evangelical church and Christians read the situation the way you've laid it out for us, which is to read it through the positive rather than the negative, right? Read humanity and our capacities through the lens of the positive telling of our goodness rather than the I think the overriding impulse is to I think I think part of the reason maybe we get stuck in the system of sacrifice only flowing upward is maybe because of how flippant we are about just describing people's motives and their loves and what drives them through the negative, through idolatry and sin and all of those other things rather than through goodness. And so maybe we just sort of like, this is the way it is, this is the way it's always going to be, and there's nothing we can really do about it. I just wonder what you think it would look like to even to read that instinctive impulse to viscerally uh, withdraw from your wound, your wounding, and read it as a something that should be teased over in terms of its goodness. It's speaking to the goodness of our humanity and our empathy. Am I?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I don't know. I was just trying to write a poem about cutting my fingers. That's really all I was trying to do. No, I think it's a wonderful question. And I think it's maybe that's a question for its own episode. I'm tempted to try to diagnose the genesis of that um, instinct within American evangelicalism to see people primarily through a negative lens, to construe human nature as fundamentally bad. And it's easy for me, this feels really cynical. It's easy for me to think about it strictly as a numbers game. If my goal is to fill my pews with adherents to this faith, the quickest way to do that is to convince them of their lack, of their inability, of their depravity, and hold out before them all of the terrible consequences for being as terrible as they are. And so you can imagine, pressed by the need to get people to come into the church doors, I kind of just pull a lever that works the quickest. Um, you're bad. Bad people suffer. You need to believe in Jesus so that you don't have to suffer. That feels cynical. It feels too thin. It certainly is a part of it. I don't know if it explains the whole thing. But I also wonder if part of the difficulty of reimagining our human neighbors as fundamentally good, as originally good, as basically good, generates a sense of deep responsibility in myself. It is an invitation to explore all the ways in which I might have something to offer to them and to the world. It generates a longer list of things that I might be invited to and called to and gifted for. And maybe I already feel too spread thin, right? There is something very self-protective about thinking about myself and everyone else as primarily bad and having nothing to offer. It keeps expectations low, right? It manages all the expectations really low.
Yeah, and you don't have to be with and for. You don't belong with and for and to those those people, right? You don't the obligation to that is diminished, which I don't have the capacity to belong to and with and for everybody. So there's this is a way of keeping that responsibility, that sense of responsibility at bay.
Yeah, I mean, to put it in terms of the situation you mapped out earlier, if I see you cut your fingers and I know that I have no facility in staunching the bleeding, then I'm not going to move toward you. And why would I? I couldn't fix it when I got there. And if I now extrapolate that out to all sorts of social ills,
Mm-hmm.
it certainly is a convenient excuse. That feels harsher than I mean it. It's certainly a convenient excuse to not move toward any of those because I'm just going to make it worse.
Yeah,
It's self-protective in two ways, right? It keeps people away from me that I don't want that I don't want to get near me, and it keeps me from sensing I have a responsibility to go near them to offer what creativity or imagination or gifts that I have.
yeah, yeah. I have maybe I guess to my shame, I've been out climbing with near somebody who was being really stupid, and I've packed up and left because I didn't want to be there when it all went to. Some of that was because I couldn't I didn't know that I could emotionally deal with what would have what could have transpired. Thankfully, never did.
Mm-hmm.
But two, I didn't want my climbing day ruined. So um,
I think we've all been there. I totally get that. It makes total sense. And I'm certain I could come up with any number of examples of when I've done the same thing in other categories. But the question you asked was not primarily for a diagnosis of why we don't think about our fellow human beings as fundamentally good, but how to begin to shift to do that.
yeah,
And we've mentioned this before. And this, I think this, at least if I can attempt to trace back my own shift in construing the goodness of my neighbors and of myself. It was it was when I think someone invited me to see where the story starts. That the story of the world begins not with brokenness and injustice and evil, but it begins with createdness and goodness and beauty and a real sense. I mean, if you can just stop reading at Genesis 2, we all know the story, many of us, most of us maybe, know the story well enough that we always know what's coming next. But if we could stop at the edge of Genesis 2, not knowing that Genesis 3 is coming, that story feels just shot through with possibility. Like,
mhm,
what is going to happen next? Imagine the possibilities set out in front of these two first humans, given all the gifts that they've received and the invitation to make a world. I mean, it just feels magical. Don't Hold Me to This podcast is produced by Shaynor, Newsome, and me. I'm Jeremy Reeves. A big way you can support our work is by sharing this with your friends, or if you hate it, share it with your enemies. Music this week is by Enzo Orefice and We 2050. Like the podcast, subscribe, and follow on whatever platform you are on. You can find out more, do some more reading, get in touch, and subscribe to our writings at don'tholdmetothis.substack.com. No apostrophe.